Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspective. Oh, not radical. Welcome to Feminist Question Time. Jumping ahead of myself. Brought to you by Women's Declaration International, which is the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We many of us are radical feminists, which is the epitome of TERFs and the targeted opponent of gender identity proponents. Our analysis of gender identity ideology has been consistent, very, very similar, since Janice Raymond's wrote The Transsexual Empire. It was published in 1979. So we, WDI, Women's Declaration International, were not surprised, like loads of people, or confused or mystified by this new attack on women and girls. And we haven't changed our analysis. In 2018, we wrote, it's nearly a 7,000-word declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position. And it's been signed by 38,617 people from 160 countries and is supported by 537 organisations. And the declaration, if you haven't read it, please do read it. And it basically says to policymakers and politicians and organisations, don't change the definition of the word woman to gender identity. But it explains very much why that should not be done and a lot of the damage. And the great thing is that since 2018, when WDI wrote it, we've kept it exactly the same. So it is a very strong policy position paper that you can use with politicians, policymakers, organisations. And as I've said, it's supported by people from, well, nearly 40,000 people, 160 countries, and 537 organisations have signed up to it, which is really good. Now, WDI is, our main work is promoting the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, and we have volunteer activists and country contacts in every continent and in many countries. So do join us if you want to get more involved in helping promote this work and also meeting lots of fantastic women. You can also volunteer to do other things or to donate. And look at the website, womensdeclaration.com, for that. Now, today, I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers. We have Gunda Schumann from Germany. And she is going to, the title of her talk is German Self-Identification Act is Violating International Human Rights Law. And then after that, we're going to have Elizabeth Chesak, Kristin Zebrowski, and Kara Dansky from the USA WDI. They're going to tell us about the recent WDI National Convention. And then we're going to hear from Rona Duwe from Germany, who's going to tell us about the global protest rally against German self-identification law that will be coming up. And then we'll have short news videos, that pre-record news videos from USA and from New Zealand. I'm going to go first to our first speaker, who is Gunda Schumann. And Gunda is a lesbian activist. She's Lat's Reloaded EV, member of the board. She's a lawyer, sociologist, author, and has been involved in WDI pretty much since it started. The title of Gunda's talk is German Self-Identification Act is Violating International Human Rights Law. So thank you so much for coming, Gunda, and over to you.
First, I will give you an overview over this not so easy topic. Reem Al-Salem addressed an official letter to the German Foreign Minister on 13th of June 2024 regarding the German Self-Identification Act, I call it SBGG, and using testimonies from female witnesses of male violence. In this letter, she criticizes violations of human rights of women and girls that SBGG already entails from the perspective of international law. She does not fail to mention that the proposed law has met with resistance from a large number of women's organizations and activists due to the risks it poses, especially for female victims of male violence. She draws Ms. Baerbock's, the foreign minister, attention to Germany's obligations to comply with codified human rights and asks her to answer her questions in detail. Ms. Baerbock didn't answer herself, but boasts with feminist foreign policy and her fight for abortion rights and against femicides. But first, the arguments of Reem Al-Salem. First topic, risks of concrete violence against women, including further sex-based violence against them. According to Reem Al-Salem, the SPGG in no way takes into account the specific needs of women who are threatened with male violence or who have already experienced male violence, because the law does not provide for any measures to prevent the abuse of gender registration procedure by sex offenders and other perpetrators of violence. In the following, Reem Al-Salem names 2 female witnesses, one of whom experienced sexual violence by a so-called non-binary man, and the other reports how young lesbians are forced into sexual relationships with men who identify as quote-unquote women. As to Reem Al-Salem's opinion, they prove how legal gender recognition could be instrumentalized on the basis of self-identification of sexual offenders, and it would facilitate access to their victims for those who have already committed violence against women and children in the past. In Reem Al-Salem's opinion, these acts of violence by mostly male sex offenders will increase with the entry into force of SPGG because, in addition to self-declaration, these people will also have the opportunity to have their identity documents changed accordingly. At the bottom of each slide, you see the sources of international law. Number 2, undermining single-sex spaces for females and associated trauma. Reem Al-Salem sees a risk of abuse in fine reinforcement, which protects the new identity of trans-identified men, in particular because it endangers single-sex spaces that serve to protect women and girls. In particular, she mentions women's prisons, access to which for men has not been regulated by the SPGG. Please note, these are my comments now. Prison laws that regulate accommodation of male and female prisoners are the primary responsibility of the German federal states. To date, the states of Berlin, Hesse, and Schleswig-Holstein have prison laws that allow trans-identified men access to women's prisons. All of these state governments have a coalition with the Green Party, by the way. Reem Al-Salem also criticizes the fact that SPGG emphasizes contractual autonomy, domiciliary rights, and statutory autonomy, but provides no further regulations for cases of conflict. Private operators who want to maintain single-sex spaces could face fines or criminal investigations if they want to know the former sex of the person seeking entry, or simply because they publicly express the opinion on the subject of single-sex spaces. Please note, the problem for private operators is that the legislator shifts the resolution of such conflicts to the judiciary. The German General Equal Treatment Act, abbreviated AGG, serves as a legal basis for admission or its denial. The problem here is a lack of clarity regarding the legal definition. Question: does the prohibition of disclosure also apply in the case of an obvious appearance? That means if the person requesting entry is clearly recognizable as a man. Even if prohibition of disclosure is applicable in this case, the allegedly injured party would still have to prove in court that the attacking party had the intent to harm. 3 other witnesses who are victims of sexual violence have reported to Rem Al-Salem that their mental health suffers from the presence of men in their shelters, regardless of their identification, and that they would consequently exclude themselves from social life if they could not be sure that the rooms are reserved exclusively for women. Rem Al-Salem emphasizes the dangers of re-traumatization when victims of sexual violence are forced to share their spaces with men. On top of this, there's a ban on disclosure, which is particularly negative for women, in her opinion, when it comes to spaces for their private part. Rem Al-Salem points out that in the area of human rights conventions, different treatment on the basis of sex and gender identity is certainly permitted if it is based on reasonable and objective criteria, pursues a legitimate aim, and if its consequences are appropriate and proportionate to the legitimate aim being pursued. In this specific case, this would mean that in justified cases, there may be single-sex spaces for women to which trans-identified men do not have access. That is applicable for safe spaces, but also for autonomous spaces for lesbian women, for example. Number 3, lack of trauma-informed approach for women and girls who are victims, survivors of violence. In RA's view, all states parties have an obligation under international law to have legal procedures in place to prevent stigmatization and re-victimization, especially in cases of sexual and gender-based violence. Equally important are procedures that prevent the use of stereotypes that blame the victims or prevent them from going public with their experiences for fear of re-victimization. RA names 2 female witnesses who reported having been victims of sexual and gender-based violence by men who described themselves as non-binary or transgender. The women insisted that they had special protection needs as female victims. Both were criticized for going public with their experiences. Their testimonies were each dismissed and they themselves were labeled transphobic. Furthermore, RA notes that there is no information on whether the state authorities have investigated these cases, nor whether there are procedures in place to prevent the re-victimization of women who have experienced sexual violence through access of trans-identified men to single-sex shelters and services. Number 4, obligation to collect, disaggregate data based on sex. Rem Al-Salem insists that states should collect up-to-date and reliable data on gender-based and sexual violence, indicating the sex of victims and perpetrators and the detailed background of the violent offenses. These data are particularly important in order to correctly classify sex and gender-based crimes against women, offenses that are mostly committed by men as perpetrators against women as victims. SBGG, on the other hand, says nothing about how the state intends to deal with the lack of reliable data on an individual's sex and the impact that the lack of such data has on the categorization of these offenses against women and girls. Number 5, the negative impact on women's and girls' highest standards of mental and physical health. Rima Salem names a detransitioner who reports that she was not sufficiently informed about the procedure. She underwent hormone therapy and a double mastectomy without understanding the short and long-term implications and consequences for her health and physical well-being. RA states that under SBGG, therapeutic counseling is no longer required for gender transition. It remains unclear, however, how the legislator intends to ensure that people receive counseling in order to adequately understand the consequences of gender reassignment. In view of the fact that the SBGG also authorizes gender transition of minors, it is also particularly important to ensure that these children and their families understand the consequences of such an intervention for their mental and physical health. According to the findings of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in its General Comment number 15 of 2013, children's ability to give consent must take into account their maturity and age. Furthermore, children's welfare is paramount. SBGG, which allows adolescents from the age of 14 to legally change gender, even against the will of their parents, provided it has been authorized by a family court, calls into question the child's welfare, especially with regard to the responsibility and rights of the parents who have to ensure the best interests of the child. Furthermore, the connection between social and medical transition is irrefutable, even if the legislator explicitly states that the SBGG only regulates social transition. Number 6, information on the lack of safeguards for the best interests of the child, particularly concerning girls. Rima Salem is concerned that under SBGG, children under the age of 14 are not protected from being victims of forced legal transitions by parents or other guardians, particularly because of the power imbalance between children and adults. Research has generally shown that lesbian, autistic, and depressed girls are particularly susceptible to social influence and pressure, which leads them to assume that the solution to their problems lies in transitioning to the opposite sex. RA notes that SBGG does not contain any protective clauses to avoid such risks and thus exposes girls to particular health risks in the case of medical transition that often follows. Number 7. Information on the risks to freedom of expression, religious freedom, and the prevention of violence due to the ban on disclosure. Rima Salem believes that the ban on disclosure, which is subject to a fine and makes it an offense to disclose a person's biological sex without a public interest or a credible legal interest, has a serious impact on women and girls. My note: as mentioned earlier, it is essential that the biological sex of a transition person must not be generally known or known to the addressee, and the disclosure of the biological sex must be made with the intent to cause harm in order to fulfill an administrative offense. The problem here is the ambiguity in the legal definition. Does the prohibition of disclosure also apply in the case of an obvious appearance, male facial features, beard, and etc., or not? In any case, the prohibition to name one's biological sex is a severe violation of the freedom of expression. Okay, that was Rima Salem. Now the reply. The federal government rejects Remal Salem's allegation that it violates a number of human rights obligations by recognizing the right to self-determination. Rather, it states that the SPGG is based on solid human rights standards. The foreign minister has not replied herself. The reply comes from the permanent mission of the Republic of Germany to the United Nations. My note is to this first argument of the government. Remal Salem does not say that recognizing the right to self-determination is in itself a violation of human rights. She says that its uncontrolled consequences are likely to violate the human rights of women and girls. The German government goes on citing legal sources. First, the Basic Law, which is the German Constitution. The government says, the main motivation for the enactment of the SPGG was precisely to protect gender identity, which is in line with the general right of personality enshrined in Article 1 and 2 of the Basic Law. My note, however, the fundamental rights under Articles 1 and 2 of the Basic Law, which also include gender identity, that's right, must be balanced by the legislator with other possibly competing fundamental rights of women enshrined in Article 3.2 and 3.3 of the Basic Law. The federal government does not mention this tension ratio. Number 2, international legal sources and policy. Furthermore, the concept of SPGG would be in line with international recommendations and regulations, says the German government. A. In 2010, the Council of Europe issued a recommendation on combating discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, in which it called on member states to take appropriate measures to ensure legal gender recognition, including by enabling the change of name and gender in official documents in a quick, transparent, and accessible manner. B. This recommendation would be in line with various judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, in particular with regard to the right to respect for private and family life, Article 8, EHRC. My note, the quoted judgments of the ECHR refer exclusively to the right of transsexuals to change their gender entry. The effects on women's rights have not been the subject of the respective proceedings. C. Germany also refers to an initiative by 28 member states of the United Nations led by Argentina and supported by 66 organizations which are campaigning for the legal recognition of gender identity through self-identification. My note. The number of 28 UN member states is relatively small in view of the total of 193 member states. In addition, as to my information from Maria J. Binetti, WDI, Argentina is not involved in that initiative anymore. D. Finally, Germany cites the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2019 and that of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, abbreviated SOGI, from 2018, which have advocated for the same goal. My note, the SOGI expert has been fighting for years, not for the recognition of lesbians and gays, but exclusively for trans-identified persons. Next argument, legislative procedure and meaning and purpose of the SPGG. First, the SPGG was allegedly subjected to a thorough review during the legislative process through the involvement of NGOs. My note. The NGOs included by the lead ministries of the federal government were hand-picked, following the transgender ideology. Although other NGOs were also able to publish their statements on the websites of the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth, and the Federal Ministry of Justice, including Lutz Reloaded, they were not taken into account in the formation of political opinion. As a consequence, the effects of the SBGG on women and girls were not at issue. Second, the following institutions also supported the SBGG according to the German government: German Women's Council, German Institute for Human Rights, Amnesty International, Federal Association of Women's Support Services and Women's Crisis Helplines, and the German Association of Women Lawyers. The German Women's Council, an umbrella organization with 60 women's associations, supposedly explicitly welcomed the SBGG, particularly denouncing the increasing violence against intersex and trans people who identify as female and warned against the reproduction of mistrust and false stereotypes by associating the law with transgender persons posing a threat or being violent. My note. Voices critical of gender in Germany, especially those of the autonomous women's and lesbian movement, the political opposition, and the medical profession, are completely ignored. 3. Purpose of SBGG. The SBGG only allows non-binary, intersex, and transgender people to adapt their civil registry entries and identity papers to their gender identity, the government says. My note is, the SBGG goes far beyond this. It allows any adult person to have her or his gender entry in the civil register changed once a year by self-declaration without any state control. Furthermore, this time limit does not apply to minors. The government goes on. It does not make any other legal changes, for example, to the General Equal Treatment Law. The SBGG is therefore not concerned with access to single-sex spaces. My note. SBGG helps the trans activists to conquer women's spaces insofar as sex is equated with gender identity. The AGG does allow exceptions to prohibited discrimination for the protection of privacy, for example, of women. But in the event of a legal dispute, in the absence of a legal clarification, courts ultimately have to decide whether or not trans-identified men may be excluded from women's spaces for the reasons mentioned in the Equal Treatment Law regarding of their registered gender. Gender-specific spaces combating violence against women and non-binary, intersex, and transgender people. First, the safety of single-sex spaces, especially women's shelters, would have always been a concern of the federal government. Violence by so-called cis men, transgender speech, against women is a fact. My note. The violence of trans-identified men towards women, see the statements by Rima Al-Salem, is simply ignored. The Association Frauenhauskoordinierung, in English, Women's Shelter Coordination Association, also welcomed the SBGG and expressed its concern about the increasing violence against intersex and transgender people who identify as female and about their particular marginalization. My note. Autonomously organized women's shelters are usually non-profit associations and therefore dependent on state support. They are therefore ultimately faced with the choice of becoming trans-inclusive or having to do without state support. Women's shelters have been founded since the 1970s by women of the autonomous women's movement to protect women from male violence. Today, men can often demand entry due to trans inclusivity if they have experienced violence. However, this does not necessarily mean that biological women and men with a different gender identity are treated equally by the staff at the Women's Refuge. The gender-specific role behavior also continues in women's shelters to the detriment of women. However, this problem is not discussed publicly, rather in the social media. Number 2, Germany shares Remal Salem's goal of eliminating gender-based violence. That is why A, Germany ratified the Istanbul Convention in 2017. My note, in the Istanbul Convention, unfortunately, woman is not clearly distinguished from gender identity. See Article 3.f and Article 4.3. B, the government would currently also work on the federal government strategy to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence. My note, there is an EU Commission proposal on this, which, because it conflates sex and gender identity, met with protests in 2023 from radical feminists, including Let's Reloaded. C, and on a bill to support survivors of gender-based violence. My note, the bill is called Violence Assistance Act. It is conflating sex and gender identity and does not provide single-sex spaces for women in women's shelters. Because of its voluminous area of application, female and male victims, it would require a huge amount of taxpayers' money and will therefore have little chance to become law. D, the cause of violence against so-called cis women, transgender, non-binary, and intersex people would have common roots based on misogyny and gender role stereotypes. Therefore, strengthening the rights of transgender, non-binary, and intersex people, which would eliminate harmful gender role stereotypes, would also benefit women and girls. My note, this assumption completely fails to recognize the sex-based interests and needs of women and can only be described as ideologically driven. Remal Salem's arguments regarding violence by trans-identified men towards women are not addressed. E, violence against transgender, intersex, and non-binary people would have increased. The government says in 2022, there would have been 417 politically motivated crimes against these people in Germany. My note, it would be interesting to list and compare the increase in violence against women, for example, femicides. What about the increase in violence by trans-identified men against young lesbians, for example? Unfortunately, there are no figures on this. We will take care of it. Child welfare. The best interests of the child would be protected by SBGG, according to the government. A, the suicide rates of gender dysphoric children would be alarming. My note, this is scientifically controversial. See the German Medical Journal 2022, which with the title, When Puberty Gets Stopped. There you have scientific discussion on this. B, the German Ethics Council and the Child Protection Association would advocate support for children's gender identity. My note, the Association of Parents called Trans Teens Sorgeberechtigt, Trans Teens Care Authorized, which has been educating the public about the danger of transgender ideology for years, is not mentioned. Of course not. C, the federal government also points out that children aged 5 and over would have to be present at the registry office if their gender entry is going to be changed by their legal guardians. In addition, the declaration of the young person before the registry office or the custodian would also have to contain information about previous counseling. Incidentally, the SPGG would only regulate change of the legal gender entry, which could be changed again at any time. My note. These arguments in no way take into account the differentiated argumentation of Rima Salem. For example, the connection between social and medical transition, the ability of children to give consent, the lack of safeguards for children under 14, the best interests of the child, and the child's right to identity. My conclusion. For the federal government, there are no differences in interests between women, girls, and trans-identified men. Single-sex spaces for women, including lesbians and girls, are therefore irrelevant. According to the federal government, strengthening the rights of trans-identified persons also benefit women and girls, as a cause of discrimination against both groups of people is rooted in patriarchy. Following this logic, violence by trans-identified men against women, including lesbians and girls, does not exist. On the contrary, the former are increasingly victims of violence. Their potential perpetration as men vis-à-vis women as victims is not being addressed. The rights of girls to informed consent, especially at the critical developmental stage of puberty, and the connection between social and medical transition are completely ignored. Here, ideology stands against facts. Thank you for your attention.
We're going to move on now to Elizabeth Chesak, Kristin, Zebrowski, and Kara Dansky. They're from WDI USA, so Women's Declaration International USA. They're going to tell us about the recent national convention. And before we hear from them, we're going to play a short video about that convention.
I'm Elizabeth Chesak. I am currently a board member and I serve as president of WDI USA. And joining me today, we'll have former president and WDI USA's legal consultant, Kara Dansky, and our Georgia state contact and chief of staff, Kristin Zebrowski. We had our third annual national convention in Atlanta, Georgia on September 20th through 22nd. And we had about 80 women there. So here's just a fun picture of us at the convention. We all look extremely tired. So I've been reflecting on all that took place that weekend, and would like to share my thoughts as we say farewell to yet another year's amazing convention. What does it look like to amplify the women's liberation movement? We showcased the research and writing of a wide variety of talented, thoughtful women. We talked about protecting women's rights as a Democrat in today's environment, WDI's book, Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs, Building Bridges Between Women, the DSM-5's sexist diagnosis of quote-unquote gender dysphoria, lesbian culture, how the current trans movement uses the playbook of the 1970s left to attack today's feminists, sexism and gender ideology in progressive social movements, the challenges young women in particular face and how they can become involved in the feminist movement, the quote-unquote LGBT movement and transgender ideology, fan fiction, gender nonconformity and femininity, fetal personhood laws as a threat to women's liberation, what women across generations have to learn from each other, and the experiences of desisted and detransitioned women. And this picture is the current board. And this is a picture of us tuning in live to FQT. So this was fun. I love this picture so much. In her closing remarks at our first convention in 2022, Dansky said, quote, "We wanted to light a torch that would turn into a flame that would keep burning until all women and girls are truly liberated," end quote. A few years on, I think it's safe to say that we did. From the initial spark in 2022, reigniting the women's liberation movement, we fanned the flames last year in San Francisco, accelerating the movement. And now this year's theme of amplifying the women's liberation movement has culminated in passing the torch. It's been wonderful to see young women, intergenerational friendships, mothers and daughters, women from other countries, and women determined not to put up walls but to build bridges. I'm equally pleased by the number of women who said that this was their first ever in-person women's gathering. Quite a few of you said you'd only become aware of the power and potential of women's liberation within the last few years. Our message is getting out there, uniting women who might otherwise never have met. I'd like to end with two quotes that I think are particularly relevant to this year's theme of amplifying the women's liberation movement. The first is a passage from Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin. Quote, "In her heart, she is a mourner for those who have not survived. In her soul, she is a warrior for those who are now as she was then. In her life, she is both celebrant and proof of women's capacity and will to survive, to become, to act, to change self and society. And each year she is stronger and there are more of her." End quote. She wrote that almost 40 years ago, but she could be writing about us today. And as Kara often says, if we can be heard, we will win. So I have pictures from my two panels that I was part of. This isn't a panel picture, but this is Fern Lopez and I on the Desisted and Detransitioned Women's Caucus. So Fern and I and another woman named Celine, who was unfortunately not able to attend in person, make up that caucus. So it was lovely to get to meet Fern and to be on that panel with her. And it was just a very proud moment because I got the idea for the caucus shortly before last year's convention. And I just remember being so nervous about, floating the idea of whether we wanted to do this. And so I'm just extremely proud of how far we've come. This is the promo image for the intergenerational panel. So this was my brainchild, and it was facilitated by Kara and then included 5 women across 4 generations. So Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, and Baby Boomer. And this panel was also just very special to me because when I was in college, one of my programs that I studied was called Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. They don't really have women's studies anymore, at least not as widely as they used to. And so it's just been so transformative for me to talk to older women, to talk to Gen X and Boomer women and be mentored by them and, discuss theory and history and how it applies to our own lives. And I always come away with reading recommendations. So that panel was so much fun. And both of these will be available as recordings on our YouTube channel shortly.
I'm the Chief of Staff of WDI USA, and I've served as the Georgia State contact since November of 2020. As many of you know, our previous conventions took place in the Mid-Atlantic and West Coast regions. So when the survey of potential locations for the 2024 convention went out last November, I eagerly proposed a few Southeastern locations. And I believe that Georgia was an important place to bring WDI's message to, as Georgia is the only state in the Southeast that doesn't yet protect women and girls' sports. However, our Lieutenant Governor has recently vowed to support that cause. By January, I began gathering proposals from venues in Atlanta so that the board could select a perfect site for our convention. I'm thrilled that this vision came to life. With the city of Atlanta selected and the theme of amplifying the women's liberation movement secured, I turned my attention to programming when the request for session proposals went out, focusing on how we could foster unity among women. After consulting with the rest of the Black Women's Caucus about my idea to submit a proposal for a session that addressed the tribalism among women that often holds us back as a collective, a session that explored how women could become more unified politically, socially, legally. I was fortunate to have my fellow caucus members support my intended proposal. I reached out to women whose insights on women's rights I found particularly compelling, especially those whose backgrounds diverged from the radical feminist archetype. I saw this diversity as essential for fostering a rich dialogue. Ultimately, our panel featured an incredible lineup of speakers, starting from the right. There's Denise Traina, a dedicated activist and co-chair of the Georgia Green Party, who emphasizes the importance of respectful dialogue and creating the world we want to live in. Then Mary Elizabeth Castle, the Director of Government Relations for Texas Values, recognized for her advocacy in child protection and commitment to women's rights. Dr. Suzanne Bierling, who I believe is here today, and who most people are familiar with here, a global leader with extensive experience in child welfare and mental health. She brought a wealth of knowledge to our discussion. And on the left side, Alexandra Renee, also known as Pinwheel Art, a passionate motherhood activist who focuses on bridging gaps within the feminist movement. This session, titled Building Bridges to Amplify Women's Liberation, explored common ground among women from diverse backgrounds and with different approaches to women's liberation. We emphasized how embracing a variety of experiences can enrich our movement and foster collaboration for greater impact. During the session, our distinguished panelists shared pivotal moments from their journeys that have shaped their approaches to feminism. They reflected on how their unique backgrounds informed their activism, providing inspiring insights into their social and professional experiences. One of the key topics we explored was the imperative of inclusivity in advancing women's rights, where panelists discussed what inclusivity means to them and why it's crucial for the success of our movement. They shared real-life examples of situations where embracing diversity led to significant positive outcomes, showcasing practical implementations of inclusive practices that we can all learn from. We also delved into strategies for bridging ideological divides among women when working towards preserving women's rights. Our panelists recounted specific instances where they successfully found common ground, leading to unexpected alliances and advancements in their work. Their stories emphasize the importance of collaboration and open dialogue in overcoming differences. Another important aspect of our discussion focused on leveraging diverse skill sets to enhance the effectiveness of feminist activism. The panelists highlighted how various skills have played a crucial role in advancing feminist goals and discussed some skills that are often underrepresented and undervalued in our movement. As panelists shared actionable steps for fostering inclusivity within feminist circles and activist efforts, the panelists addressed common challenges they've encountered and the solutions they've implemented to promote inclusive practices. To conclude the session, each panelist provided a call to action, encouraging participants to take specific steps in their communities to make a tangible impact. As I delivered my closing remarks, the final visual displayed was a poignant tweet from Venice Allen from September 13th. It stated, "The last time I spoke to Magdalene, she asked me to do everything I could to unite all the women in this fight, and I promised her that I would. It's not always easy to work across the aisle, but infighting is a waste of energy when there is still so much work to do. I hope the insights shared during this session inspire women to take meaningful steps toward that goal and that we engage in thoughtful conversations and actions with other women, both within and beyond our circles. Together, we can build bridges and create a stronger women's liberation movement." This convention was an empowering experience that was also emotionally challenging at times. The common thread across each session was clear. The fight for women's sex-based rights is far from over, and the forces seeking to silence us are as relentless as ever. However, in the spirit of collaboration and unity, it was a privilege to be surrounded by such formidable women. Helping to organize and participating in this gathering of passionate advocates reinforced my belief that together we are stronger. The road ahead may be tough, but with the passion and resilience demonstrated at this convention, I know women will continue to push forward. Through solidarity, we can make significant strides in preserving and advancing women's sex-based rights. I left the convention inspired to carry that spirit of unity forward.
Okay, so my portion of our presentation on the U.S. Chapter's 2024 convention will focus on the panel I facilitated on Friday night called Protecting Women's Sex-Based Rights as a Democrat in Today's Environment. As many audience members know, the U.S. Democrats have been sacrificing women and girls at the altar of so-called gender identity for years. President Biden has been saying that transgender discrimination is the civil rights issue of our time since at least 2012. In 2015, a group of Democrats introduced the so-called Equality Act in both chambers of Congress. It's been around since that time. If enacted, that bill would redefine sex to include so-called gender identity for literally all purposes under US civil rights law. It would mean the complete annihilation of all female-only sports and spaces. It has passed in the House of Representatives twice, both times under Democratic leadership, but has never reached a floor vote in the Senate. In 2016, President Obama issued a guidance document to schools across the country, instructing them to define sex to include so-called gender identity for all purposes under Title IX, which is meant to protect women and girls as a sex class in the educational arena. And of course, President Biden notoriously issued Executive Order 13988 on his first day of taking office, instructing federal agencies to redefine sex to include so-called gender identity for all purposes under federal regulatory law. As a political party, the Democrats' embrace of so-called gender identity is nearly total. But that doesn't mean there aren't individuals who are pushing back, and I wanted to invite some of them to present their views and experiences during the convention. The panelists were Val Applewhite, who is the second from the left panelist on your screen, Maud Marone, who's on the far left on your screen, although not in reality, and Jenny Poyer Ackerman, who's sitting next to me toward the right. Val Applewhite is a state senator in North Carolina. In 2023, she became one of the first and only Democratic lawmakers at the state level to cast a vote to protect female-only sports. I was delighted when she accepted my invitation to speak. Maud Marone is a mom of four who lives in New York City. In 2021, she ran for city council as a Democrat, and the next year she ran for Congress as a Democrat. At some point, she put, quote, "I stand with J.K. Rowling" in her Twitter bio. And of course, everyone here knows what that means. She was not expressing her love of Harry Potter novels. "I stand with J.K. Rowling" is basically a turf bat signal. So I reached out to her, and we've been friends ever since. During her run for Congress, she was excluded from a town hall event to which every other Democratic candidate had been invited. The city's Democratic establishment had decided that she was transphobic and should not be permitted to speak. The city's Democratic elite eventually hounded her out of the party, and these days she's an independent. Jenny Poyer Ackerman is one of the founders of the group Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender, which goes by the acronym DIAG. This group was formed mainly by parents on the political left whose children are caught up in the cult of trans. Most of the group's leaders remain anonymous because their children are still caught up in it. It's only Jenny who feels she can speak out because her daughter desisted from the cult of gender. Jenny was there to talk about the urgency of rank and file Democrats taking a firm stand against party leadership. Senator Applewhite kicked off the panel by telling the story of what it was like to rebel against her own party by casting a voice vote in support of a Republican-sponsored bill to protect women's sports. When the bill landed on her desk, she considered it thoughtfully. She said she thought about her son, who is himself an athlete who stands at over 6 feet tall. She thought about whether it would be fair for him to compete in women's sports if one day he decided he's a girl. She realized that, of course, it would not be, and made the decision to vote accordingly. On the day of the vote, there she was, on her own in the Senate chamber, the lone Democrat to take a stand. She told us that she received a tremendous amount of support privately, but was publicly vilified. Someone had the gall to call her, and I'm sorry for this language, a transphobic whore. She has stood her ground, though. And I'm happy to say she stayed throughout the entire conference. I'm sure she learned a lot about the gender cult that weekend. Maud told us about her experiences of being a New York City Democrat who vocally supports women's sex-based rights. It hasn't been easy for her. She did eventually win a seat on her local school board. In that capacity, she persuaded a majority of school board members to vote to revisit a 2019 city policy allowing boys to compete in girls' sports and access girls' spaces. Her proposal was very modest. It didn't demand the removal of boys from girls' sports and spaces. It simply called on the city to reevaluate the 2019 policy. Even that was too much for the gender cult, and they have been harassing her ever since. The school chancellor even took the outrageous step of kicking her off her seat, to which she had been duly elected by local parents. I'm happy to report that she successfully sued to be reinstated. Jenny went last and talked about DIAG's work. DIAG's main goal is to empower rank-and-file Democrats to talk to their elected officials and explain the leftist critique of so-called gender identity to them. For the most part, Democratic elected officials ignore those of us who speak about these things, but DIAG is committed to the idea that our Democratic elected officials cannot ignore all of us forever. And if enough of us keep speaking out, we'll be able to make a difference. There was plenty of time for Q&A, and one questioner pointedly asked the panelists if they were willing to share their thoughts on who they intended to vote for in the November presidential election. I braced myself because I was a bit terrified of what would happen. I knew that Maud was likely to say that she's voting for Trump because she is tired of the Democrats' assaults on women's rights as well as free speech. I knew that Senator Applewhite was likely to say that she's voting for Harris because she finds Trump to be an unacceptable alternative. I knew that Jenny was likely to say that she did not plan to vote for either candidate. At the time, I had forgotten that Jenny has actually expressed an intention to write in my name, which is very flattering. Maud did indeed say that she plans to vote for Trump. Senator Applewhite did indeed say that she plans to vote for Harris. Jenny reiterated her intention to write in my name. The reason I was terrified is that I worried that the conversation would cause rancor among convention participants. I didn't want to kick off the convention by discussing an extremely contentious issue that convention attendees likely had very strong views about. Now, my purpose in sharing all of this today is not to express any view on how or whether any American should vote in November. This election season is the most intense I have ever experienced. Emotions are running high. People have very strong opinions on all of this. My point is simply to say that I was very happy that the panelists handled the matter with perfect decorum. I'm sure Senator Applewhite was shocked to hear that a Democratic woman had changed her party affiliation and planned to vote for Trump. Notwithstanding her 2023 vote to protect women's sports, Senator Applewhite is not as immersed in these matters as many of the rest of us are. Despite everyone's strong views, the panelists were extremely respectful toward one another. And even better, the discussion did not seem to cause a lot of rancor among convention attendees. Everyone seems to understand that this presidential election is absolutely agonizing for many women on the political left who want to protect women's sex-based rights. I'll just conclude by saying that there are countless rank-and-file Democrats all over the country who are furious at party leadership for sacrificing women and girls at the altar of so-called gender identity. Many of us speak out using their own names. Others do so anonymously. Still others don't have large platforms, but they speak with friends and family members. There are plenty of Americans on the political left who feel completely betrayed by our party leaders. My main purpose in hosting the panel was to demonstrate that it is possible to advocate for women's sex-based rights as a Democrat in today's America, if only more people could do so. Okay, now I gave some closing remarks at the end of the convention concerning an upcoming case that I want to address briefly. This case is called Olympus Spa versus Armstrong. Olympus Spa is a female-only spa outside of Seattle. Nudity at the spa is expected and preferred. I have experienced this personally, having been to the spa on a few occasions when I lived in Seattle. So, a man named Caleb, who calls himself a woman named Haven, brought the spa before the State Human Rights Commission, arguing that its female-only policy violates his rights under Washington state law. WDI USA opposes all men in female-only spaces, including those who have had surgery. But it's worth noting that Caleb has not had surgery to remove his genitalia. He won before the State Human Rights Commission. So the SPA sued both him and the Human Rights Commission in federal court. The federal district court ruled in favor of him and the Human Rights Commission because Washington state law prohibits discriminating against men on the basis of men's gender identities. In its decision, the federal district court repeatedly and uncritically used the phrase transgender women with male genitalia. The SPA appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, where WDI USA filed a friend of the court brief. Our brief makes the following arguments. First, if the relevant state law elevates gender identity over sex, it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Second, that Washington state cannot both prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and also enforce its own criminal laws against indecent exposure and voyeurism. And third, the word transgender is a linguistic sleight of hand that obscures the material reality of sex and entrenches regressive sex stereotypes. While I was writing the brief, I found myself feeling infuriated that a United States federal court would use a phrase like transgender women with male genitalia. I realized I was going to have to define the phrase male genitalia to explain why this is such a problem. So I did. I cited a definition of male genitalia from the National Institutes of Health, which was basically a list of male reproductive and sexual organs. The brief then continues, quote, at no point did the district court explain how individuals with male genitalia can be a type of women. It goes without saying that women do not have any of these organs. It is truly a testament to where we are as a society today that it must be said in the context of federal civil rights litigation that women don't have penises. So the Federal Court of Appeals will hear oral arguments in the case next month, and the US chapter fully intends to be at the courthouse to rally in support of women and girls as a sex class. Thanks, that's all I have.
So we'll move on now to Rona. So Rona is a radical feminist, a blogger, author, a spokesperson for the initiative Lasst Frauen Sprechen, which is Let Women Speak, but I think it's probably not exactly linked up with the UK one. But she's going to talk to us. So welcome, Rona. It's so lovely to see you. She's been very involved in organising the global protest rally against German self-ID law and is now going to tell us about that. So over to you, Rona.
On November 1st, the German self-ID law Selbstbestimmungsgesetz will come into force, one of the most extreme self-ID legislations in Europe. We believe that if an influential country like Germany legalizes self-ID, it will have an impact on the whole of Europe. Our initiative, Lasst Frauen Sprechen, and the group L-Squad Berlin, Frauen Sprechen, have organized a protest in Berlin on November 1st. Ina Wagner, founder of the initiative Lasst Frauen Sprechen, had the idea of mobilizing a worldwide protest and ask women and feminist groups around the world to take part in the protest and demonstrate in front of German embassies and consulates on November 1st at 12:05 local time. This goes back to the history of our group and our first protest in front of the Norwegian embassy in Berlin in 2022 in solidarity with Christina Ellingsen, who was persecuted by police for saying that men cannot be women, mothers, and lesbians. We wrote a letter to the ambassador of Norway and managed to get the embassy staff out and listen to us for 2 hours. Imagine that. Ina tried to mobilize for 2 months and only 3 women were interested in our international protest. She thought we will have only 5 women in 3 countries. The whole thing caught fire when I introduced Ina's idea in the international protest group that gathered for the spontaneous Paris protest against men winning Olympic gold medals for punching women. Roisin Michaud had organized this spontaneous protest. Now I'm talking about the protests in Berlin. Our slogan in Berlin is for science, democracy, women and children. It's 12:05, which means if we don't act now, women's rights are gone. We are using the analogy of the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's dystopia 1984 because the self-ID law in Germany threatens with punishment to speak the truth and call a man a man. We are supposed to deny the perception of our eyes and ears, but feminists, however, encourage us to trust our eyes and ears and speak the truth, and our rights as women rely on the reality of sex and sex-based oppression. In Berlin, we will have well-known speakers focusing on feminism and science, including Helen Joyce and Bev Jackson. There will also be an open mic at the end, where I want to show you the video. We launched this video campaign for the international protest at the beginning of September. The video was produced on Canva. I copied this approach from the group United Women for Women's Rights. They had launched a similar campaign to protest against the misogynistic policies of UN Women. This group is a cooperation of the Brazilian group Matria and the US group Wolf. Canva makes it very easy to translate a video and other campaign materials into different languages by providing women with a link to the document. It's a very low-level way to set up an international feminist campaign. The video has now been translated into 16 languages, including Japanese, Chinese, and Icelandic, also Bulgarian, with the help of many women and one man. It has been widely shared and discussed, including in Japan. We also received a Chinese translation from feminists in Taiwan. Imagine this. As many people shared the video independently on different platforms, we have no precise control over how often it was played. Almost from the beginning, we also had extremely experienced and professional support from women in the UK who have also been organizing the protests in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin since the beginning of September together with us. They have set up their own Twitter account for the protest, created an Eventbrite event, and are sharing daily information and a countdown. Again, we collaborated for the graphics via the tool Canva. They have brought in well-known British feminists and feminist journalists to share the protests on their platforms and have supported us with organization and translation at the international Zoom meetings. The London protest will be particularly large, and more than 100 women have registered to come. So thank you so much at this point. We also had several appearances at WDI Feminist Question Time UK and also in Australia. And I will be at a RADFEM conference in Milan next weekend to present the protest. We also organized 3 international Zoom meetings where we discussed the organization together and 2 Twitter spaces for informal exchanges between women. In addition, there is a constant organization via email and messages via social media. At the Zoom meeting, we also agreed on the hashtags to be used to share pictures, films, and posts about the protest. Our hashtags will be self-ID harms and women rise. The hashtags can be supplemented thematically as desired. For example, self-ID harms children or self-ID harms lesbians, or for example, women rise in Montreal. But it's important that the hashtags stay like they are and you just add a word because we want to get the hashtags trending on November 1st. So these are the countries who told us they will participate. By now it is England, Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, France, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Luxembourg, USA with 8 cities, Canada, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, India, Taiwan, and Japan. In some of them, women just send letters to the ambassador. In others, they will do a protest in front of a German embassy or consulate. Other women will just send pictures with a protest sign or participate in spreading the news via social media. We may not know all countries which are organizing. Since the beginning of October, we also had a campaign running on social media with a countdown to November 1st in cooperation with the women in UK and also with women in France. We have asked women here to make a video or a text statement about why they are taking part in the protest against the German self-ID law. And in Germany, we are also using the countdown to provide background information on the law. Unfortunately, we can't do it in quite as much detail as we had planned, as there are more ideas than women who can implement them. We are still calling on women to send us videos and statements about why women from all over the world are taking part in this protest. On our campaign website, we provide a letter to the German ambassador, a draft for the letter, and list the countries where we have more detailed information about organizing groups, so you can join. We have also provided more information about the law and a printable flyer in English. If you are organizing a protest in your country, or if you would like to share a video or a written statement, please get in contact with us. I show our email address, and you can also, at the end, I also show our social media accounts. So we still look for information because we also want to do a 24-hour coverage of the international protest via our Twitter account. So if to do this, we need to know exactly when, where, and with which account the women are reporting on their protest. So please write to us. To summarize, this seems to be one of the largest international protests against self-ID, and we are overwhelmed by the international willingness to take part in this protest. We have received feedback from many women and groups that the special thing about this action is that no single group stands out as an organization, but that it is a grassroots action for which women from very different groups are cooperating. Some of them don't even have a group. We hope that we can carry this spirit forward and use it for further protests. Women should be able to count on the global women's community to stand up when anti-women legislation is introduced in their country. Yeah, there are the contact information.
Now we're going to watch the 2 news clips that we have from USA and from New Zealand.
Kia ora from New Zealand. So we've just celebrated 1 year since the general election, which brought in our coalition government. And one of the parties in that coalition government agreed to defund any sports bodies that allowed men to compete in women's sports and to legislate for single-sex facilities. And while neither of these have been implemented yet, the news of last week is that the National, which is the Conservatives like the Tories of Britain, have their Minister of Sport and Recreation has told Sports New Zealand they have to rewrite their guidelines with a view to fairness and safety as well as inclusion and diversity. So that's a really good thing, because our guiding principles were heavily supportive of trans inclusion in women's sports. Well, basically that means men's inclusion in women's sports. And the Minister of Sport and Recreation has said that he doesn't think that the current guiding principles reflect community expectations, including sport at a community level. So that was really good news, and I'll put the link up for that. And then last weekend, Rona Duwe, she's one of the founders of Save Women's Sports Australasia. She spoke to the New Zealand First Conference, and I'll put a link up to her speech because it's really excellent and highlights not just the unfairness of men competing in women's sports, but also the indoctrination of our children in schools, which is still happening. So I'll put that up as well. The Speak Up for Women is organising our global participation in the global action against the new German self-ID law, and that protest will be the first in the world because of the time zone. So we're all trying to get people along to that and organising for that. We may be unfurling banners over the motorway as well as the protest outside. So I think I may have reported last week about New Zealand prescribing up to 7 times more puberty blockers to young transgender patients compared with other similar countries. And they did a comparison with the Netherlands, Denmark, England and Wales, and we were miles higher than all those. So the researchers are saying that that we probably have easier access to assessment than those other countries. So making all sorts of excuses why we have why we're out of step with the rest of the world. I don't think we're out of step with Australia. I think we share that unlikely status. But what was noticeable in the article in our major newspaper was that they had one person who was advocating for the research itself, but 3 doctors and professors arguing that we're framing the data as alarming, and that overlooks, I'm quoting, the reality that more individuals are receiving the care they need to live authentically and improve their mental well-being. So we can't really win with our media. They go out of their way. So the other news from New Zealand is that the guy we call Tomato Boy, Eli Rubashkin, he's gone to the High Court to appeal his conviction for common assault, which is when he attacked Kelly J. Keane and Tanya Sturt, who was one of the organisers of the Albert Park event, Let Women Speak, in March of last year. He is arguing that he didn't throw the tomato juice over Kelly J. He poured it. But the main argument is that he hasn't been able to find work. He lost his job as a pharmacist, and because he's got a technical assault, he's not able to get work. It's interesting because he frames himself as intersex, but the media calls him transgender. They don't seem to know that they're not the same thing. And so then the next thing is that the Law Commission in New Zealand is looking at hate crime legislation, and that is despite the fact that this government has said they're not to look at hate speech. But what it turns out, the police have been collecting data on what they call hate crimes since the mosque massacre in 2019, and that includes so-called hate crimes in relation to gender identity. So they also have incidents of non-criminal hate incidents, which the police are reporting as well. So we're quite interested as to why the police are recording incidents and reports that are not criminal activity. Finally, we had questioned whether the Health Committee really wanted to hear from us in an oral submission on surrogacy, but we've got a slot and it's this morning at 9 o'clock. So we'll be presenting for WDI as well as the Women's Rights Party and taking a hardline stance that we don't think that there should be a ban, particularly on international surrogacy.
WDI USA has recently published a number of interesting and thought-provoking blog posts that I'd like to direct your attention to. The first, titled 5 Questions, is an interview board member and Black Women Caucus facilitator Lorraine Nolan participated in for the Dutch book Gender Rebels, which, as Marianne Jason spoke of at Saturday's FQT, is an anthology of interviews and essays on a variety of topics. In the interview, Lorraine discusses the impacts of gender identity ideology specific to Black women, as well as her personal perspective on the adultification of Black girls. The next is a piece contributed by our Lesbian Caucus, which presents a progress report on the lesbian coming out group hosted weekly by the caucus. The online space allows women to discuss with each other as peers the challenges and questions being raised in their lives by lesbianism, and the report covers some of the topics that have been discussed in the group thus far. In our most recently published post, Why Abolish Gender, What It Would Look Like and How to Do It, takes a critical look at the existing system of gendered culture, i.e. a system of male domination and female submission, and suggests a plan for abolishing that system. Each of the contributing authors is a member of either the Lesbian Caucus, Lauren Levy, the Desisted and Detransitioned Women's Caucus, Fern Lopez, or the Black Women's Caucus, Lorraine Nolan, and presents an analysis and strategy from all three perspectives. Next, a comprehensive analysis of insurance claims data by the advocacy nonprofit Do No Harm reveals that at least 14,000 U.S. minors underwent gender transition treatment, surgeries, or both between 2019 and 2023, with healthcare providers billing $120 million for those services. This 5-year tally is a conservative estimate, and the true figure is likely significantly higher. Do No Harm published the findings of their medical claims data analysis last week in a comprehensive website that allows users to investigate pediatric gender transition and surgery data by state and by individual institutions within each state. Apparently, the thing that never happens has happened thousands of times in America. On September 30th, several parents and a grandfather filed suit against the Bow School District in New Hampshire, claiming a violation of their First Amendment rights after school officials threatened them with ejection and arrest, then imposed no trespass orders against them for wearing pink XX wristbands as a form of silent protest during the Bow High School girls' soccer game on September 17th. The plaintiffs wore the wristbands in protest of the policy that allowed a male athlete to compete on the opposing girls' soccer team. The no trespass orders barred the parents from school grounds and events, one for a week and the other for the entire fall term. The lawsuit seeks to prevent the unconstitutional application of several school policies and asks the court to enjoin the school from using these policies to restrict non-disruptive expression of political or social views at extracurricular events. Requesting swift intervention, The lawsuit also seeks to allow the plaintiffs to attend their children's school events, including the ongoing soccer season, and silently express their views on protecting women's sports. Last week, in a preliminary ruling, a federal judge allowed that the Bow parent previously banned from school property for the rest of the season may now attend his daughter's games, provided he doesn't engage in any protest activity. Judge McAuliffe said the notion of whether parents should be allowed to passively protest at student sports events was legally nuanced and complex, and he wanted to hear more detailed arguments presented by both sides at the next hearing, likely to be held in late November. And finally, 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that a trial court judge in Georgia's Fulton County had struck down the state's 6 weeks abortion ban, aka the fetal heartbeat law, making the procedure legal up to 22 weeks of pregnancy. Unfortunately, the ruling was immediately challenged by the state's Republican Attorney General, who appealed directly to the Georgia Supreme Court as the case involved a challenge to the constitutionality of a state law. Last Monday, the court temporarily reinstated the state's 6-week ban, halting the trial court judge ruling that had overturned the law. The order took effect yesterday and will remain in place while the state's appeal is considered. However, the state Supreme Court left in place part of the trial court's ruling, blocking a separate provision of the law, giving state district attorneys broad access to the medical records of abortion patients in their respective counties. And that's all I have today. Thank you.